crippled and discarded on the road to die. A cowboy lifted her up and gave her peace. The first thing I did was check if she was breathing. Not because I expected her to be. The way she was lying, face turned into the caliche dust, one arm caught wrong under her body, I figured she was already gone. You see enough animals die on that road, the Rio Bravo country south of the Nooses, you get so you can tell the shape of a living thing from the shape of something that has left off living. She had the wrong shape, that's the honest truth. She looked like something set down and left. But I got down off the horse anyway. I don't know why exactly. I'd been riding since before sunup, and I had 22 head of cattle strung out behind me on a lead line, and the horse under me was blowing hard in the heat, and I had 4 miles yet to water. None of that is a reason to stop for what looks like a dead woman in the road. But I stopped. My name is Cal Reeves. I was 51 years old that September. I've been running cattle in that country for going on 23 years, most of it alone or close to it. Not because I preferred solitude exactly, but because things had gone a certain way and I'd never found cause to change the direction. My wife Nora had died 11 years before. Fever took her, 3 days' ride from the nearest doctor, which might as well have been the moon. After Nora, I didn't see much point in putting down roots in any one piece of ground. I moved cattle, I fixed what broke. I kept my word, that was the whole of it. I want to be clear about what kind of man I was when that happened. Not bad. Not good in any special way either. I was a man who had done the same thing for a long time and had gotten good at it and had learned not to want things that weren't going to come. I'd been handsome once, I think, or anyway Nora had seemed to think so, but 11 years of sun and wind and bad water and sleeping on the ground had put paid to that. I was lean and brown and weathered through, the kind of man who is invisible in a certain light, which suited me well enough. The cattle didn't care what I looked like. The banks didn't either, not when I settled accounts, and I always settled accounts. I got down and knelt in the road beside her. She was alive, barely. I could see the rise and fall of her ribs under a dress that had been torn at the shoulder and caked with something dried and dark. Her hair was loose and matted across her face, and her feet were bare, no boots, no shoes, nothing. The soles of her feet were cut up bad, the kind of cuts that come from days of it, not one bad step. Whoever had put her here, or whoever had left her when she fell, had not given much thought to her ending. Or maybe they had given it exactly that much thought and were satisfied. Her left leg was at a wrong angle below the knee. Even through the skirt I could see it. The bone might have been broken, or it might have been something worse, I couldn't tell yet. What I could tell was that she had not been lying there a short time. The sun had gotten to the back of her neck and hands in a way that takes hours. The caliche under her face was dry. She'd stopped sweating, which in September in that country meant she was in serious trouble and probably knew it. I said something to her in Spanish. Just Senora, because I didn't know her name, and I touched her shoulder very lightly, and she made a sound that was not a word but was at least a sound, and that was enough. I've done a lot of things in my life that I'm not certain were right. This one I was certain of before I'd finished kneeling. I got the cattle settled on a line tied to a mesquite clump. They were trail broke. They'd stand for a good while if they had to, and I got my bedroll off the back of the saddle and spread it in the narrow strip of shade on the west side of a sandstone outcrop about 40 feet off the road. The shade was maybe 4 feet wide, which would cover her if she lay on her side and didn't move much. I set it up anyway. It was what there was. Then I went back and I lifted her. She was lighter than I expected and heavier than I was ready for, both at once. Light because she was a small woman, maybe 35, no more. Heavy because unconscious weight goes its own direction and you can't partner with it, it's all yours. I got her up off the road and carried her to the shade and laid her down easy as I knew how. And she made that sound again, the one that wasn't quite a word but was trying to be one. I gave her water first, a little at a time, tipping my canteen against her lips, waiting, letting her swallow or cough, and then trying again. It took about 10 minutes before she was swallowing on her own without me tilting her head. Her eyes opened, but they didn't focus. She looked at the sky, and then at me, and I don't know what she saw, but it didn't seem to frighten her, which I took as a reasonable start. I talked to her while I worked. Not much, not long sentences, just a plain running account of what I was doing so that nothing I did would be a surprise to her. I'm going to look at your leg now. I'm going to touch just below the knee, tell me if this is where the pain is worst. I've got more water, take it slow. That kind of thing. I've talked to animals the same way, not because I think they understand every word, but because the tone of voice settles them, and a person in pain is not so different from a spooked animal in that respect. You just want them to know you're not the thing they need to be afraid of. Her leg was broken about 3 inches above the ankle. A clean break by the feel of it, no bone coming through the skin, which was luck of a particular kind in that situation. The skin itself was swollen and dark, purple going black in a wide band, and the ankle was so puffed up it didn't look like an ankle anymore, more like something I'd have been worried about in a steer. The swelling told me the break had happened a while back, not hours, longer than that. She had her jaw set in a way that told me she'd been holding pain for a long time and knew how to do it. There was something almost methodical about the way she held herself while I worked, still, deliberate, eyes open and watching me, not the ceiling, not the sky, me, like she was taking inventory. I didn't blame her. If a stranger picked you up off the road and started handling your broken leg, you'd want to know what kind of man you were dealing with. I cut 2 straight pieces from a dead branch of scrub oak I found 10 yards back. I used strips from the hem of my extra shirt to wrap them and tie the splint not too tight, just enough to hold the bone from moving. When I was done, her breathing changed. The held breath she'd been keeping came out slow, and her face changed a little, not relaxed exactly, but less like a fist. She said something. Her voice was rough from thirst and from whatever she'd been through, but the words were clear. She asked, "Are you going to leave me here now?" I said no. She studied me for a moment, the way a person studies an account they don't quite trust. I said it again, "No, I'll take you somewhere." She said, "Where?" I told her about the line shack east of there. Roof, walls, a stove, a water barrel. Better than a strip of shade beside a rock. She looked at the cattle on the line, looked at the pack horse, looked back at me. She was already calculating, already thinking practically about what I was going to do and what it was going to cost me and whether she believed I was going to do it. She said, "Your cattle will slow." I said I was aware. She almost smiled at that. Not quite. More like the thought of one, which for the moment was all she had the energy for. Her name was Rosario. I found that out on the trail east, walking the horses slow, the pack horse carrying her and me on foot alongside with one hand near the horse's bridle and one eye on her keeping her from slipping. She'd grown up outside of Musquiz, she said. Father had a small place, cattle and corn and a kitchen garden her mother kept. 6 children. She was the oldest. She'd married a man who worked horses for a ranch south of Del Rio when she was 22, and she'd been in Texas the 8 years since. Her husband had died 2 winters back, a horse rolled on him, and that was that, one bad moment. She'd stayed on doing laundry and cooking for the ranch until 3 weeks ago, when a new man bought in and started trimming whoever he could, and she was among those trimmed. She'd been walking north when she went off the road. The road had a steep cut where a dry wash ran under it, and in the dark, she'd been walking at night to avoid the heat. She'd gone off the edge in a spot she hadn't known was there. The leg broke when she hit the bottom. She'd climbed back up on her hands and her good knee because the alternative was lying at the bottom of a dry wash, and she'd been making her way north on that arrangement ever since. That's how the hands had gotten the way they were. The palms were scraped through to something raw, and she hadn't been able to do much about it. She told me all of this in a flat, reporting voice. No self-pity in it, no angle, just the facts laid out so I'd understand what I was dealing with, same as I'd have laid out facts to a man I was working with. I had the sense she'd made her decision somewhere in the bottom of that dry wash, live or don't, and she'd chosen live, and everything since then had been logistics. The line shack was in rough shape when we got there, not because I'd let it go, but because no place in that country stays right for long without constant attention, and I'd been down the nooses the better part of 6 weeks. Mice in the flour sack, that was the first thing. The water barrel was half down. The stovepipe had a new lean to it from a wind I'd probably missed. 2 shingles on the south face of the roof were lifting. But there were 4 walls and a door that latched and a rope bunk with a ticking mattress, and I got her onto that and got the stove going and water heating and went about the rest of it in order. She slept hard for about 14 hours. The fever came up on the 2nd day. I'd expected it. Broken bone in that heat, badly dehydrated, hands and feet abraded through. Her body was going to fight it, and fight wasn't free. She ran hot for 4 days, sometimes talking in her sleep, sometimes just lying still with her breath shallow and her face tight. I kept cool water on her face and neck, kept the willow bark tea going, gave her the small amount of whiskey I had for the nights when the pain was bad enough she couldn't sleep. I didn't sleep much either, though not for any particular reason other than I'd got into the habit of checking on her every hour or two, and you can't do that and sleep fully at the same time. On the third day, she was well enough to be difficult about the water, meaning she didn't want me to have to keep bringing it to her. I brought it anyway. She accepted it and didn't argue more than once. On the fourth day, she was talking normally. On the fifth day, she shelled 2 pounds of dried beans from the sack on the shelf, which I hadn't asked her to do and wouldn't have thought to ask. And she found the needle and thread in the kit I kept up there, and she fixed a tear in my canvas pack that I'd been meaning to get to for the better part of a month. She did it better than I'd have done it. Tighter stitches, straighter line, the right way to reinforce the corner so it wouldn't tear again in the same spot. When I came in with wood, she told me what I ought to do about the stove pipe. She was right, and I did it. I want to tell you what those days were like, those first weeks, because they don't match what you might expect. It wasn't soft, and it wasn't careful the way things are when strangers are being polite with each other. The shack was hot in the afternoons and cold at night, and there were things I had to do for her that were purely practical and not comfortable for either of us. Changing the dressing on her leg, helping her out to the outhouse when the ankle was still too swollen to put any weight on, that kind of necessary business. But there's a way two people settle into close work together when they're both practical and neither one of them has any particular use for pretending. We got there faster than I expected. Maybe because we both had some practice with difficulty and not much patience for going around it. She asked me on the fifth day how long I'd been alone. I said 11 years since my wife died. She didn't say she was sorry, which I appreciated. She just said, "Do you find it easier or harder than at the beginning?" I thought about it. I said, "Neither, just different." She nodded like that was the answer she'd expected, and maybe the one she was working toward herself with her own 2 years of it. I went into Brackett on the 7th day for supplies and to wire the man in Uvalde who'd been waiting on his cattle delivery. He wasn't pleased. I explained the situation about as briefly as I could, which in a wire is brief indeed, and I told him I'd have them there inside 3 weeks, and if that wasn't satisfactory, he could let me know, and I'd find him a buyer for the herd at current price. He wired back that 3 weeks was acceptable, which was what I'd expected. I'd been delivering to him for 9 years, and I'd never been more than a day late, and he knew it. While I was in Brackett, I bought her a pair of boots, secondhand from the dry goods man, best guess at her size. I also bought a second canteen, a new flour sack, some carbolic for the leg dressing, and a small bottle of decent whiskey to replace the one I'd mostly used. The boots were 75 cents. I didn't spend much time thinking about whether it was the right thing to do. She needed boots, and I was in a town that sold them. She held one in both hands when I gave them to her and looked at it for a while before she said anything. Then she looked at me. She said, "You didn't have to do that." I said I knew it. She looked at the boot again. Then she looked at me again. She said, "What are you going to do when I can walk?" I said I hadn't decided. She said, "I'm going to be walking in 2-3 weeks. You should think about it before then." I said, what did she mean? She said, "I mean where you want me to go." I told her that wasn't something I was planning to tell her. Where she went was her business. She looked at me level then, the same look she'd given me in the road when I was setting the splint, that measuring look, the one that didn't have any performance in it. She said, "I can cook, I can keep a place. I can do leather work, saddles and tack. I learned it from my husband and I'm good at it. I can work cattle if you need extra hands for sorting or branding. The leg won't stop me for that, not after it heals right. I've handled cattle since I was 8 years old." I said, "I know you can." She said, "So?" I said, "So what?" She said, "So I'm telling you what I can do. I'm not asking for charity. I'm telling you what I have, and I'm asking if you want any of it." The stove was ticking, settling. Outside in the brush trap, the cattle were moving, steady, quiet sound of hooves on dry dirt. I sat with what she'd said for a minute. I said, "I don't have a permanent place. I move with the cattle. Different camps, different shacks, wherever the work is. It's not much of a life for anyone else to be attached to." She said, "I've been living on a road and a dry wash for 3 weeks. I'm not asking for permanent. I'm asking if you want to keep working together." I said, "Yeah, all right, yeah." She put the boot down beside her on the bunk and didn't say anything else about it. Neither did I, but something settled between us right then. The way a fence gate settles when you lift it exactly right and drop it into the hinge, that clean, soft sound of a thing fitting the way it was made to fit. No drama in it, just done. She walked the first time on the 12th day, boot on the good foot, the splinted leg stepping carefully, one hand on the door frame. She went 3 feet outside and stood in the sun for a full minute with her face up and her eyes closed. Then she came back in and sat down on the bunk and didn't say anything about it. But I saw what those 3 feet meant to her. I'd been watching her every day she hadn't been able to do it, watching the way she held herself still when she wanted to be moving, and I knew what 3 feet in the sun cost and what they were worth. She was walking without the splint in 3 weeks and walking without any support at all in 5, though she had a slight catch in the gait on the left side that she probably always would. She said it didn't hurt, just felt different. I believed her. She was not a woman who said things she didn't mean. That was one of the first things I learned about her, and I never had cause to revise it. I want to tell you about those weeks working cattle together, because that's where I came to understand what kind of woman she was, if I hadn't known it already. She had good instincts, not just with cattle but with work in general, with figuring out what needed doing and doing it without being asked and without making a production of having done it. She didn't perform helpfulness. She was just helpful, the way a good tool is useful, not because it wants credit, but because that's what it was made for. When I came in tired, she had coffee. When I was trying to figure out the quickest way to sort a herd, she'd already looked at the same problem and had a better answer. She didn't always offer it right away. Sometimes she waited to see if I'd get there. If I got there, that was that. If I didn't, she'd say it. She had a better eye for injury in a cow than I did. I've said that before, and I want to say it again because I'm not the kind of man who throws compliments around loose. If I say it, I mean it. She could spot a bad hoof or a pinched tendon from 20 yards further than I could see it, and she moved quietly enough that she could get close to a herding animal without spooking it, which is a particular gift. You can't teach the quiet. You either move that way or you don't. I watched her one afternoon gentle a heifer that had gotten into some wire and was in a bad state about it, frightened and bleeding and rolling her eyes white. Rosario got to within 3 feet of that animal talking the whole time, very low, steady Spanish words I couldn't quite hear, and she got her hand on the heifer's shoulder and held it there, just held it, not moving, not pushing, just present until the animal stopped fighting and stood. Then she got the wire off. I thought about that heifer for a long time after, not because of the heifer, because of the patience it required, the particular kind of steadiness that can say to a frightened thing, "I'm not the danger, stop running, I've got you." Most people can't do that. Most people don't have the stillness. They get impatient, or they get rough, or they take it personally when the animal doesn't trust them right away. Rosario had the stillness. In October, I drove the cattle up to the man in Uvalde who'd been waiting. Got a fair price, settled accounts, bought supplies for the next run. He asked me if I'd found some trouble down on the Nooses Road, and I said yes, some, and he didn't ask more than that. His wife gave me a piece of apple pie and a look that said she thought there was more to it than I was letting on, but she didn't ask more than that either. I was 3 days in Uvalde. On the 4th morning, I packed what I'd brought and turned the horse south and rode back to the line shack. I want to say that clearly because it's the important part of that stretch of things. I didn't say I was coming back. I hadn't promised. We hadn't discussed it. I went to Uvalde, I did my business, and then I turned south. Not because I'd worked out some plan or because I'd decided something in a dramatic sense. Just because south was where I was going. I didn't have to think about it. She was on the roof when I rode in. She'd gotten up there somehow with a handful of cedar shingles, replacing the ones she'd told me were going rotten on the south face. She heard the horse and looked down. She didn't say anything at first, just looked at me. Then she said, "I thought you might not come back." I said I thought about it. She said, "And?" I said I came back. She climbed down off the roof. She walked to me, no limp now, or nearly none, just that slight catch I'd come to know as hers, and she stood in front of me and looked at my face for a long moment, not performing anything, just reading. Then she put her hand against the side of my face, her palm flat against my jaw, steady and warm. I don't have a way to tell you what that felt like. That doesn't sound like less than it was. It was a small thing in the physical sense, her hand on my face. But I'd been alone a long time, not just from Nora dying, but from a longer habit than that, a kind of walling off that happens to a man who has learned to handle everything himself, and something had gone off in me about it, the way a spring goes dry so gradually you don't notice, until you go to put a bucket down and there's nothing there. She put her hand on the side of my face, and it was like finding water. I put my hand over hers, and we stood there in the yard in the October afternoon light, and the horses behind me were blowing easy. and the cattle in the brush trap were settling for the evening, and the cedar shingles she'd left on the roof edge were sitting up there waiting for the morning, and none of it was in any hurry. We were married in Brackett that December, just us and the county clerk and a woman from the clerk's office who served as witness. Rosario wore a blue dress she'd made herself in the 2 weeks before, working in the evenings by lamplight, and I wore the cleanest shirt I owned, which wasn't saying much, but she'd pressed it for me that morning and it was doing its best. The clerk was a man named Flournoy who had done this enough times that he got it done in under 10 minutes and managed to make it feel like something anyway. Rosario's hand in mine was steady. We had biscuits and coffee at the hotel dining room afterward, and then we rode back to the shack because that was where the cattle were, and someone had to be there. That was 21 years ago. I've been trying to work out how to tell the next part. It's not one thing, it's a lot of things. It's 21 years of days, most of them ordinary by any reasonable accounting, cattle work, fence work, cooking and cleaning, and the 1,000 small repairs that a life requires. I can't give you every day. I'll try to give you the ones that matter. She learned the cattle business from the ground up, things her father's small place had taught her, and things the road had taught her, and things I taught her. She was a faster learner than any man I'd hired in 20 years, not because I say so, but because she could see a thing once and know it, and because she wasn't too proud to say when she didn't know something, which is the real learning tool and the one most people can't pick up. She also taught me things I hadn't known I didn't know. She had a system for the leather work that was better than what I'd been doing, more efficient with the material, the stitching stronger at the stress points. She knew things about the land that I'd been riding over without really seeing, which plants the cattle would avoid, and whether that was sense or foolishness, where the water ran underground in a dry year, how to read a storm in the afternoon light 2 hours before it got there. She'd grown up paying that kind of attention to country, and she'd kept the habit. We had a rhythm between us inside of 6 months that I couldn't have told you how we got to. It just happened. 2 people working together in close quarters toward the same ends, day after day, and the friction and the settling, and eventually you know each other in that bone-deep practical way that's different from any other kind of knowing. You know how the other person thinks. You know what they'll do before they do it. You know when to push and when to leave it alone. She was right more than I was. I'll say that plainly because it's true, and because I've never been a man who left truths out just because they cost him something in the accounting of pride. She saw clearer than me on most things that weren't purely physical. She was better at people, reading them, handling disputes, knowing when somebody was telling you half the truth and letting you figure out which half. We had a fence-line dispute with a neighbor in the winter of 1867 that I was ready to settle with a rifle, and Rosario sat down at the table with this man, and a pot of coffee, and 3 hours later the fence was moved 200 yards, and both parties were satisfied, and nobody had to explain themselves to anybody afterward. I couldn't have done that. I'd have hardened the whole thing and it would have gotten worse for years. I got hurt in 71. Threw my back out bad, bent wrong picking up a post, and felt something go in a way that said I was going to know about it for a while. I couldn't stand straight for close to 3 weeks. Couldn't get on a horse for 5. Rosario took over the full load of the cattle and the camp and the daily work of keeping things running, and she did it without a speech about it, and without making me feel useless while she was doing it. She'd come in at the end of the day and tell me what had been done, and what still needed doing, and what her plan was for the next morning, the way you'd brief a partner, keeping him current, not making him feel like a passenger. When I was well enough to start in again, she handed the load back over the same way, just handed it back. Here's where things are. Here's what I left for you. I've never forgotten that. There are a lot of things from 21 years that blur together, and there are a few that stay sharp. That 3 weeks stays sharp. We settled on the hill country land in 1873. East of the Frio River, 160 acres with a spring that ran all year, which in that country is the same as saying the land was alive. The house that was there needed work. We did the work over 4 years slowly because there was always cattle to tend and money was always going somewhere practical, but we got it right. By the time we were done, it was a good house. Solid. The kind of place that doesn't announce itself, but doesn't apologize either. I remember the day we put the first fence post on our own land. My own land, our land, I should say. I said it wrong even now. I had the post maul in my hand, and I'd just driven the first post, and I straightened up, and Rosario was looking at me. She did that sometimes, just watched me with a particular look that I still don't have a word for exactly. It was something close to pride, but it wasn't that. More like satisfaction, maybe. Like she was looking at a thing that had turned out right and acknowledging it. Like she'd known it would turn out right, and here was the proof of it, and the proof matched what she'd believed. I'm not a man who carries a lot of ideas about himself. I've never thought of myself as someone remarkable. I worked hard and honestly, and I kept my word, and I tried to leave things better than I found them, and that was about the size of it as far as I was concerned. But when Rosario looked at me that way, there was something else. There was the sense that she had looked at all of it, the work, the years, the steadiness, the keeping of accounts and words and animals, and made a decision about its worth. And the decision was worth something. Worth a good deal, in fact, worth riding a hard road with. I've thought about that look a lot. I think about it still. There's a thing that happens to a man when a good woman looks at him that way. Some part of him that was running a little crooked straightens itself without being told. Not because she made him do it, because it turns out something in him was waiting a long time for exactly that, and it never knew it was waiting because it had given up expecting it to arrive. And then it arrives, and the man stands a little different from that point forward. More settled, more sure of what he is. That's as close as I can get to it with the words I have. We had a daughter. She was born in the spring of 1869, and we named her Clara. She has her mother's eyes and her mother's way of looking at a problem, from the side first, to see how it fits before she commits to a direct approach. She's 22 now. She's married to a man who builds roads for the county, and they live in San Antonio, and they have a boy of 2 who is the loudest thing I have ever been in a room with, which I mean as a compliment. Clara comes out to the Frio land 2 or 3 times a year, and she brings the boy, and he runs the property end to end the entire time he's there, and falls asleep before supper every night, which suits all of us. I watch Rosario with that boy, with Clara too, and always have. Whatever I am as a father, I did my honest best, though I was 42 when Clara was born and had spent 20 years before that not being a father, and the habits of solitude are hard to thin out. Whatever I am, Rosario is more. She gave that girl something I couldn't have given her alone, a kind of example. A way of being a woman who didn't owe an apology for herself, who worked alongside whoever she was working with and expected to be taken at her word, who faced down hard things without requiring someone to acknowledge how hard they were. Clara got that. I can see it in her. I want to say one more thing about the ranch, about the hill country land and what we made of it. By 1878, we had 40 head of our own cattle, good stock, and a small contract to supply beef to a garrison south of San Antonio. We had a hand, a young Mexican man named Eduardo who stayed with us 4 years and learned the business well enough that he eventually bought his own place down near Eagle Pass. I attended his wedding. Rosario cried, which was only the second time I'd seen her cry. The first was when Clara was born. After Eduardo left, we had 2 more men over the years, neither of them as good as him, but both of them capable, and we worked with what we had. Valley knew us. That's a particular thing in a place like that, to be known. Not famous, not the biggest operation, just known as people who paid fair wages and treated a man straight and didn't cheat in the small ways that a lot of people cheated because they thought no one was keeping account. Someone was always keeping account. And when a young man came through looking for work and someone recommended Cal and Rosario Reeves' place as a place worth working, that had a value I can't put in dollars. There was a bad year in 1875, drought, and I won't dress it up. We came close to losing the land. The spring held, but the grazing didn't, and we sold 20 head at a loss, and I spent the better part of 3 months looking at the account book and working the numbers from different angles to see if any of them came out differently. They didn't. But we didn't lose the land, partly because I'd built a reserve over the years from not spending money I didn't have, and partly because Rosario made an arrangement with a dry goods man in Brackett to supply him with saddle repair work through the winter. And between those 2 things, we kept the land. She told me about the arrangement after she'd made it. She'd gone into town on her own while I was out working the far pasture. She'd gone to see him and laid it out and agreed to terms and come home and made supper and told me about it over the meal. I sat with it. I wasn't sure whether I was annoyed or not. It's not that I thought she'd done something wrong. She hadn't. She'd done exactly the right thing in exactly the right way. I think what I felt was something closer to wonder, which is not something I'm accustomed to feeling about another person's business. She'd seen the problem, and she'd found an answer, and she'd gone and got the answer without needing to ask permission, and the answer was the right one. I said, "How long have you been thinking about that?" She said, "About 3 weeks." I said, "Why didn't you say something?" She said I was working out whether it was viable first. No sense discussing something that might not be viable. I said, fair enough. She said, are you going to tell me I should have asked you first? I thought about it, I said no. She said, good. That was how we talked, not soft and not hard, just straight. I'm 72 now. My knee gives me trouble in cold weather, and there are mornings I move slower than I used to, and the account in the mirror has changed considerably from what it was when I knelt in the road beside her that September. Rosario's hair is mostly silver. I told her last spring that I liked it better than I ever had, which was true, and also something I'd been meaning to say for a few years. And she looked at me like I was about 10 minutes late on the observation, which I was. The spring on the Frio land has been running good this year. Best I've seen it in 7 or 8 years. The grass came in thick in March. We've got 30 head now down from the peak years, which is the right number for 2 people our age to handle without Eduardo or any hired help. The fence is mostly right. The house is warm. Last week Rosario was out at the south fence line checking the posts in the wet corner, where the spring creeps into the soil and the ground stays soft, and the posts rot faster than anywhere else. I watched her from the porch. She was wearing her canvas jacket and her old hat, and she moved down the line carefully the way she moves now, steady and sure, pausing at each post, checking the base with her boot, marking the ones that needed replacing with a strip of red cloth she keeps in her pocket. Quick, efficient, no wasted motion. She found the 2 bad posts in about 10 minutes, wrote something in the little notebook she keeps in her breast pocket. Then she looked up and saw me watching from the porch. She lifted one hand, not a wave, more like, here I am, there you are. The simple acknowledgement of 2 people who have been in the same country long enough that they don't need to say much to say everything. I lifted mine back. The sun was coming level and gold across the Frio pasture. The cattle were moving slow toward the water. The cedar fence posts threw long shadows east, the good ones and the ones she'd marked, all of them in a row. She's coming in now. I can hear her boots on the porch steps. I can hear her pull the door, and I know from the sound of it that it's Rosario and not the wind, the same way you know a sound that belongs to your life from a sound that doesn't. That's all. I'll tell you one more thing, because it's the thing I've never quite been able to leave out when I think about that September. I drove past that stretch of road again 4 months after, coming back from a cattle delivery. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. I just knew when I was getting close to it, and I watched for the sandstone outcrop. And when I saw it, I stopped the horse and sat there for a minute. The bedroll had been long gone by then, of course. Whatever trace there'd been of a woman lying in that dust, months of weather had sorted out. The road looked like a road. The caliche was pale and empty in the afternoon sun. There was a clump of dried grass growing at the base of the outcrop where the shade hit it every day, which I don't think had been there before, but maybe it had and I hadn't noticed. I don't know why I stopped. I'd done what I'd done, and she was alive and at camp, and that was the end of the story as far as the road was concerned. But I sat there a minute anyway. I thought about what would have happened if I'd ridden past, and then I stopped thinking about it, because thinking about it had no useful application to anything. I'd stopped. That was the thing that had happened and the only thing worth knowing. But I'll say this. A man rides a road for enough years and he stops seeing it. It becomes the thing between where he is and where he's going, and the middle of it doesn't particularly matter. You're watching for hazards and you're counting miles and you're thinking about the cattle or the account or whatever's next, and the road itself is just a fact. I'd ridden that road 100 times. I'd have told you I knew it. I didn't know what it had. I turned the horse and rode back to camp. Rosario had the stew going. The shack was warm. She heard me come in and looked up from the stove and said, "How'd it go in Uvalde?" I said, "Fine, good price." She nodded and handed me a cup of coffee, and that was that. That's how most days were, not remarkable from the outside, warm from the inside. I don't know how else to say it. You either know what I mean or you've still got some living left to do.